Welcome back to another reading from a book I once wrote called Where is the Hope? If this is your first time to join one of our readings, I wrote a book back in the 1990s. I carried it around until around 2008, and I had the courage one Thanksgiving weekend at my dad's after reading a book from Ira McManus called Wide Awake, and my dad's encouragement to publish this book. I self published it, gave it away for free, and been just reading it. For some reason, recently I decided why not put it out there again using social media and the various different platforms because it might still be helpful to someone. And so I'm going to dive right into today's chapter. Chapter 12 is called Fools for Christ. It's a little bit longer than the other chapters, so I'm going to read it maybe at 1.2 speed for you. How about that? So let's dive in. You probably won't take this well at first, but it is something you need to be reminded of. That is, you are a fool. Told you wouldn't take that well. Now you're probably thinking that's not a nice way to begin this chapter, but it's the truth. That's what we are. That is how the world views us, and as a matter of fact, that is what we really are. Notice what Paul says about this as he discusses the incompatibility between what the world counts as wisdom and what Christians consider wisdom to be. This is from 1 Corinthians 4. Already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. You have become kings, and that without us. How I wish that you really had become kings so that it might be kings with you. For it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like men condemned to die in the arena. We have been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as to men. In the first century, when the Romans would win a battle and return home from war, they would have a victory parade through the city streets. The king, the officers, the mighty warriors would parade through the town with all of the bounty they had taken in battle. And then at the end of the procession, they would have their hostages, their prisoners, and they would parade them through town like trophies as they humiliated them. And that's what Paul was saying the apostles are like, because they are at the end of the procession. They are being made a spectacle to the whole world. But notice how he continues in verse 10 when he says, we are fools for Christ. In Paul's estimation, the people of those days viewed him to be a foolish man because of the gospel that he preached. And I believe that we who are Christians today need to realize that to many people, the things we do, the values we have, the morals we try to follow may seem foolish to those who are worldly. I mean, we have to do many things that many people in the world frown upon and make fun of. And by the way, this was written in the 1990s, but I think it's still true today. For example, abstaining from drugs and alcohol in a culture where these things are so prominent, or remaining sexually pure until marriage. But unfortunately, we live in a society where we are laughed at many times for trying to be pure and holy and to do what is right. It doesn't make sense. In a world where so many things don't make sense, you would at least think that God would. One unique thing about God is that he doesn't always make sense, at least from our perspective. To be so powerful, he sure has done a few foolish things in his lifetime. To be the creator of everything, he sure doesn't seem to always choose the right creations or inventions to get the job done. Not only does he do things that seem very foolish, we are often called to do likewise. The response that God on many occasions is looking for from us doesn't always make sense. Let me illustrate this by asking you to travel back in time with me for a few minutes to look at some examples of some folks who at first glance were doing some pretty foolish things in the sight of man, but in the end they proved to be wise in the sight of God. Stop number 1. Takes us back to a time when the world was full of wickedness. It was a time in which God was grieved that he had made man. And so the Creator decides to destroy them. But fortunately, there was a man named Noah who found favor in the eyes of God. You remember the story. God tells Noah to build an ark, a big boat, because it's going to rain and rain and rain until all the wickedness has been washed off the face of the earth. God gave Noah the instructions, and Noah did everything just as God commanded him. Imagine how the people must have reacted when they saw Noah and his boys building this huge boat. I imagine they taunted them with statements like these. Have you talked to God lately? How much longer till the flood, boatman? I imagine they ragged them pretty good. In the sight of man, this was foolish, but in the sight of God, this was very wise. Imagine how the people must have felt when it began to rain. Stop number 2. This stop brings us to the wilderness of Midian. At this time, God's children have been in Egyptian bondage for 400 years. God has heard their cries and moaning and decides that now is the time to rescue them. If Hollywood were writing this script, they would put together the greatest team of commandos in the world. Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Jean-Claude Van Damme, and let's throw in the Power Rangers for good measure. Those are still a good lineup today. But notice who God chooses, an 80-year-old shepherd by the name of Moses. When you think about it, Moses is probably the last person any of us would pick for the job. I mean, when he was 40 years old, that might have been a different story, but at 80 years old, for 40 years, all Moses has been doing is taking care of a few sheep for his father-in-law. Who would have selected Moses to go and speak to Pharaoh? It doesn't make sense. But God chooses Moses to be his leader. Had I been on the committee, I would have said, don't you think you ought to get someone who kind of has a gift for words? Maybe someone who can pronounce words well. The Bible says that Moses was slow of speech. I'm not sure what that means, but in some way Moses was the most ill-equipped man to be an eloquent orator in the world before Pharaoh. But I'll tell you why God chose him. It makes no sense. I can picture the angels saying, not him, Lord. Send someone else. No one will understand him. Send his brother. Had to stop. My computer was about to restart. So I think I've solved that problem. Okay, back to the story. Do you see how foolish God looks from our logical eyes? But in his own eyes, it was wise as he used this 80-year-old shepherd to not only lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, but to take them to the promised land. Stop number 3. At this part of our journey, we see when the Israelites were trying to conquer the city of Jericho, which was fortified by a wall that was about 7 feet thick and 16 feet high. No problem, you say. All Joshua needs is a couple of big tanks and bulldozers and a bunch of willing soldiers. That sounds like a wise plan, but that's not the plan God has in mind. You remember the story, don't you? They were instructed to march around the city once a day for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, march around it 7 times. And then when the priest blows the trumpet and when the people shout, the walls will fall. Can you imagine how foolish this must have seemed, not only for the Israelites, but for those inside the city of Jericho? But on the 7th day, after they had obeyed God's commands, the walls collapsed and the city was theirs. The very thing that seemed to be foolish in the sight of men was wise in the sight of God. How foolish all of these events must have seemed to the people involved. The Bible is full of events like these. Before we stop our time machine, let me remind you about David and Goliath. Who would have picked a little kid, a teenager, to go out and fight a giant? The angels are saying, Lord, what are you going to do? Okay, give him some rocks and a slingshot. That doesn't make sense. And how could I forget Gideon as he led the Israelites into battle against the Midianites? It was so illogical. First, God says, you have too many men. Why don't you encourage some of them to leave? His army went from 32,000 to 300. Boy, you know they're ready now. I imagine Gideon is thinking. At least God will give us some fancy weapons to use. Imagine this scene as Gideon is preparing for battle. God, let me review it one more time to make sure I haven't missed anything. Trumpet, pitcher, and torch. Are you sure we didn't leave some weapons out somewhere here? Maybe a small knife, trumpet, pitcher, torch. Oh boy, I would hate to be a Midianite though tonight. All through the ages, God has told us to do things, and man has said it doesn't make sense. And God says, I know, now go and do it. The fact of the matter is that from our logical eyes, God looks foolish. To think about it sometimes makes us feel uncomfortable. Think about it for a minute. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. John 1:14. How foolish it must have seemed for God to put the King of heaven and earth in a barn and have him born and laid in an animal food trough. That doesn't make sense. So we clean it up and turn it into a nativity scene where animals don't smell and where straw is soft and comfy. Folks, it was foolish. It was wonderfully, divinely foolish that he came from heaven to earth to show the way. Picture this. God became a man and lived for 33 years upon the earth as a carpenter. And then God died on a cross. The Creator died for the created. Folks, it was foolish. God hasn't always made sense. And the correct response to him doesn't always seem like the smart and the wise thing to do, but it is. What God calls you to do may not seem wise according to the standards of the world, but remember, we were not created for this world. People may sometimes look at you as if you were foolish, but in the end, who would you rather please, them or God? Paul says that God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. 1 Corinthians 1:27. In reality, it's not so bad being a fool after all. That is if you are a fool for Christ. So my word for you today is remember, it is okay to be a fool as long as you are a fool for Christ. I hope you have a great Friday. It is Friday the 13th, by the way, in 2020. So just wanted you to know that. Have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.